Joining me on the line is Scott McKay. He writes for the American Spectator, and he also has his own publication called The Hayride. You can check it out online. Scott, I think there's a lot of people in this country that are praying for your neck of the woods there in Louisiana with all this crazy flooding going on.
Well, certainly those prayers are appreciated. I mean, this is, when the Chinese came up with the saying, "May you live in interesting times," it was meant as an insult or a curse. And we're living in interesting times in Baton Rouge. We started with the Alton Sterling thing, and then we had 3 cops get shot by a maniac from out of town, and now we've got maybe as many as a couple 100,000 people who are put out of their houses by flooding now. So we'd like some more boring times for a while.
Hey, that's for sure. And speaking of interesting times, one of the most interesting videos I saw online was some of these rescues that have been attempted. One was very successful. This lady's car was pretty much going underwater, and a guy in a boat came by and was breaking out the back window, and that car was pretty much underneath the water, and he was able to pull her out to safety. So we're seeing a lot of heroics happening in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, there's sort of an unofficial rescue militia that is formed in Louisiana called the Cajun Navy, and basically it's all of these guys with bass boats and pirogues and airboats and so forth. When it floods here, they hook that trailer up to the pickup truck and run to the scene and get in the boat and start rescuing people. And they've plucked thousands of them out of the flooding, and hundreds of dogs and cats, and it's sort of the unsung silver lining to this is the level at which people in Louisiana will help each other without being prompted to by government or anything else.
And I think one of the first things people are automatically going to think about, especially with the way the water is rising right now in Louisiana, is Katrina and what happened there in New Orleans years ago. What are some of the differences, and what are some of the similarities between what's happening in Baton Rouge right now and what happened with Katrina?
Well, the similarities are flooding, right? I mean, the pictures look similar. It's houses with water in them, and when the flood waters recede, it's the images are the same. It's carpeting and wall insulation and sheetrock piled up in the front yard. All of that is similar. This is not like Katrina, though. The flooding from Katrina was storm surge, just like a lot of the flooding from Hurricane Sandy, for example. That's ocean water being pushed in by winds. This was not a named storm. This was not a hurricane or a tropical storm or even a tropical depression, because they measure those things or qualify them based on the amount of wind that comes in. This thing didn't have any wind. This was just a massive, intense system, that was just a rain event. And, there was as much as within 2.5 days, there was as much as 31 inches of rain that fell. While the weather forecasters had said a few days in advance that, this was going to be a significant historic rain event, they didn't predict there was going to be 31 inches in 2.5 days. And if they had, nobody would have believed it. This is something that, unlike a hurricane, which, you track from the time it's all the way out in the Atlantic, and people make their plans. I mean, this was something, it's going to rain. And then when it started raining, it didn't stop. And it was just, really, really hard rain that never lets up for 2.5 days. And by the time it was done, there was water everywhere. And anybody who lived in any of the river basins in Baton Rouge and parts east and south was subject to flooding, even if they didn't live in a flood zone. And one of the things that's really kind of most amazing about this is the fact that most of the people who are victims of this and have water in their houses right now don't have flood insurance because, up until last weekend, it wasn't seen as needed. I mean, these are places that do not flood, and yet they flooded. So, whereas people would talk about Katrina and say, well, these people shouldn't be living on the water, and all, this is not on the coast. This is, this is not a particular floodplain where this happened. And you've got houses that took 6 feet of water that are not considered floodable. So, it's really sort of a mind-blowing type of thing. And it's not unprecedented. I mean, flooding happens in lots of places. Just last year, there was some massive flooding in South Carolina. In fact, South Carolina was supposed to play LSU at South Carolina back in October last year in football, and the game had to be moved to Tiger Stadium in Baton Rouge because of the flooding. So, and interestingly enough, people in South Carolina are now, bringing convoys of supplies and stuff to people in Louisiana, as sort of a thanks for the reaching out that folks here did to folks there last year. So, and a lot of this has been done really as a matter of the private sector and, volunteer efforts, more so than, government. I mean, FEMA's administrator just made it to Baton Rouge this morning, and nobody has any particular expectations of FEMA to date. So, that's kind of something that's also a big difference between this event and Katrina, because back in 2005, everybody was sitting around wondering when the federal government was going to come in and save the day. Nobody has those expectations now.
The new governor of Louisiana, he's been criticized for a number of other different policy issues. How is he handling this? Has he done everything that he has been able to do as governor with the situation?
Well, look, John Bel Edwards is a Democrat who, as a matter of policy, I could not dislike more. But I'll be honest, I haven't come across anything that he's done yet that I would find fault in. I mean, he seems to be engaged. He seems to be, relatively competent. So far it looks like he hasn't made any major mistakes, which is really nice because we had a Democrat governor when Hurricane Katrina hit, and Kathleen Blanco was an unmitigated disaster. So, sort of set against that standard, Edwards definitely gets a passing grade today.
As far as the media is concerned, how are they covering this event? Are they covering it differently than they would any other event? And if they are, why are they covering it differently?
I see very little evidence that the national media cares about this, which is really fine, because one of the things that I notice about the national media is they have interest in stories that they can drop into their little boxes of narrative. And the key thing that we've seen with this is, we don't have black and white in Baton Rouge right now. We don't have rich and poor. We don't have gay and straight. We don't have, old and young. Everybody is in the same boat. I mean, there are $1 million houses that took 6 feet of water, alongside $100,000 houses that took 6 feet of water. I mean, there is no, environmental racism that has all the rich folks living on the high ground. I mean, that's not what this is. And so, to a very large measure, everybody is in the same boat. And there's a big movie studio facility in Baton Rouge that had some soundstage space available that when this thing hit, they made it available as a storm shelter. And, they had as many as 4,000 people there yesterday. And they were folks from all different, walks of life. You had black people, you had white people, you had people from the suburbs, you had people from right there in East Baton Rouge Parish, old, young, rich, poor, and everybody needed a place to lay their head. And it was a private, thing. And, they got, the word out that they needed all different kinds of supplies as donations. And yesterday, they put the word out, hey, we don't need anything. right? We've got more stuff than we can handle because the response was so overwhelming. And this was not put in place by any government agency. This was not put in place by any, political leadership or bureaucracy. This was a private company, depending on, friends and neighbors and volunteers to, organically put a relief effort together. And to see that in this day and age really sort of reaffirms your belief in people. The more you pay attention to politics, the more you lose that faith, the more you feel like the country's gone to hell and we're just not good people anymore. And then you have an event like this, and it's almost like God telling people something, hey, you still do have this spirit in you, act accordingly. And here in Baton Rouge, we've seen that.
As far as Katrina is concerned, when we look back at that, we always hear stories about how long it took to recover and how some areas are still recovering from Katrina. We hear that a lot in the media. What do you see as far as a time frame, as far as recovery efforts where people are back on their feet and they're going back to normal in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, it's going to be weeks and months. The economic damage is going to run into, billions and billions of dollars. Mostly I think most of the flooding hit residential areas. So, you just got a huge amount of, all these houses have got to be gutted. And then it's going to be the process of, hanging sheetrock and insulation and replacing flooring and all that kind of stuff like that. This was not at least so far, a large death event. Katrina, you had, well over 1,000 people, died. So far, the death toll for this is 8. I think that when the waters recede in some of these neighborhoods, where, the flood water is 6 to 8 feet, and you have a lot of single-story houses, I think that death toll is probably going to mount significantly, but it's not going to be anything like Katrina. So, fingers crossed on that. But I mean, it's weeks and months before, everybody's going to have their house gutted and can get a contractor in. I'm sure there are going to be people that, don't have the economic wherewithal to rebuild their houses, and there are going to be some FEMA checks necessary, and so on. And it's hard to put a good estimate on what that's going to look like, but we'll go as we go, and we'll see how it works out.
Scott McKay from the Hayride, we appreciate you. And all that you do. Tell us a little bit more about where we can find your stories and information like this as far as what's going on in Baton Rouge.
Sure. We're at thehayride.com, and we're pretty busy these days. So, if you want to find out all the, the latest information on what's going on down here, we're a pretty good resource for that. Thehayride.com.
Scott McKay, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks, Will.